Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J, and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. With this being the 20th game I've looked at so far, I decided to stretch the limits of my 5-year rule by looking at something I've wanted to play for a long time, The Witcher. It's hard to imagine being able to do this series without a service like GOG around, and it's something that anyone who cares about old school games is genuinely thankful for. CD Projekt hasn't been around for long, but even with not all that many games to their name, they've made that name into something spectacular by showing a love for the medium, and for keeping the older titles in said medium alive. Though GOG isn't just good old games anymore, even though it's arguably never been that way given The Witcher, it might not have the market share of Steam, but it's still a great platform that makes my job a lot easier. And that's all I really wanted to say with this section, because when push comes to shove, I really wanted to play The Witcher. Often when I'm looking for games to review, I'll give a bit of history as to why I think they're worth looking into, such as something interesting it did, or because of a nice theme that allows me to talk about a genre or franchise in particular. This time though, it's the 20th game I'm reviewing, and it's my show, and this is one of the rare games that my dad played to completion before I ever touched it, and that cannot stand. If you need a fancy excuse, there weren't a lot of video games sold in Poland, so here was a game that was heavily influenced by Polish culture for Polish people, so there. Also, I needed a break from the Infinity Engine because, as much fun as that is, those games can drag on for a while. This is something that my dad has been telling me that I need to play for a long time, and since he was around to taunt me with hints that somehow told me everything and nothing, I had reason to get through it. So with all of that built up, did it end up paying off or falling flat on its face? Let's find out. The gameplay is very much informed by the story, so before we get into it, let's give an overview for the world. The game is based on a series of novels by the same name, which are themselves based on Polish folklore. The Witcher in particular is Geralt of Rivia, also known as the White Wolf. He makes his living as a monster slayer due to a series of potions and mutations that make him effectively superhuman, and thus more capable of protecting himself from the more unfriendly beasts of the wild. The part where we pick up on the story occurs several years after a long war occurred and Geralt was presumed dead or missing by virtue of events that are revealed as you play. However, while he has seemingly returned from the grave, his memories didn't come with him, meaning he has to rediscover and redefine who he is in a world that is growing more hostile toward his kind. In fact, the game kicks off by some very hostile people running off with some of the secrets to the Witcher's mutations, which means right as you find yourself trying to get your bearings, you're gonna have to do it while also figuring out who is behind the attack, what their aim is, all while trying to deal with whatever happens as you interact with the locals. That's about all I can say without getting into spoiler territory, but as interesting a premise as that might be, my first impression was anything but that, and it came down to two things. To start, the combat is horrendously unintuitive. Maybe I'm just used to spending too long in games where I can spam whatever button I want, but as it turns out, that's the opposite of what you're supposed to do when you get into a fight. In order to attack, you're still left clicking to do so, but instead of spamming the buttons in the hope of getting more attacks in, doing so actually just cancels the current attack as it's going through. In actuality, you're supposed to wait for the sword which acts as the cursor for combat to be covered in fire, which will tell you that you can build up a small combo. The game doesn't explain that all that well, especially since at first I thought the issue I was having was a graphical bug. To be fair though, it's unintuitive but still an interesting idea. By setting it up like that, it behaves more like a rhythm or fighting game would, which given my lack of expertise in either of those was an interesting change. The problem with this is that they don't do all that much with the idea, as most of what they add are passive stat boosts that don't really change how you fight. To go into full detail, Geralt gets two kinds of swords at his disposal, steel and silver. Steel is more effective against humans and humanoids like elves and dwarves, while silver is used for monsters. Nice idea thematically, but doesn't change what you're doing. While using one of those swords, you can also switch between three fighting styles, heavy, light, and group, which are used for, as you would expect, larger, smaller, and groups of enemies respectively. Nice idea, but doesn't change what you're doing gameplay-wise. You also have a fair number of modifiers, such as stunning someone, causing them pain to slow them down, as well as damage over time effects such as burning and bleeding. Nice idea, but I think I've been on this train for long enough now because all of them boil down to either halting the enemy progress or applying damage over time. The only nuance in any of this are various resistances which can usually be summarized by intuition or basic flowchart. Even the small selection of spells that you have access to don't really do much to change things up, not because they aren't necessarily good, but because the first two that you get seem far superior and much safer. Heck, I could probably get away with doing nothing but spam the first spell you get, as if you're able to stun someone, they're literally a one-shot kill no matter what, which also seems to include bosses for some reason. It seems like the only people you can't eventually get a stun onto are really big monsters that only get knocked back. And not only do you have spells that don't really change up the core gameplay, You even have the potion system to not change up the core gameplay, because all it seems they end up doing is giving you useful augmentations that help you do better in the situation you're currently in. To be fair, however, this is a system that, in principle, I do like a lot. The potions that you make can be really useful to make yourself stronger both in the short term and long term, which means the combat can get a lot easier. Since that, as you probably figured out by now, the combat isn't all that complicated and boils down to some degree of number crunching, having potions around is always a good thing. Beyond the combat though, it does two things right that are worth pointing out. To start, there was a risk reward for drinking too many potions, as if you built up enough of a toxicity meter, bad things would start to happen, mostly involving sudden death. Also, you don't have all the recipes at once, which means you either have to buy or find them. Given that the amount of gold you get is limited, that then adds a nice feeling of economic management as you figure out which books to spend money on, and whether it's worth doing that over getting a better sword. Also, most of the ingredients you gather can be found in the world around you, which is where reading from books can come in handy. The more you look up, the more you learn about various herbs and other things you can gather as you move from place to place. Where this doesn't work as well though is due to the fact that I was never really wanting for resources that can be gathered out in the wild or as I'm in transit to a quest location. Most of that time, the bottleneck for potion crafting was, ironically, the bottle. Sure, you can find alcohol everywhere because the world is very reminiscent of medieval Europe, but strong alcohol that you can use as a base for potions, not so much. At least finding items that can temporarily augment your weapons weren't too hard to find either, and since the game wasn't too tricky on the default difficulty, I didn't need to use bombs too often either. And yes, you can make bombs, and I'm not going to go into the litany again because they mostly do the same thing that your other powers do, except they're not limited by your spellcasting ability. So with all of that talk about the combat, it would be easy to assume that I don't like the game, as if the core gameplay loop is largely the same throughout. Why exactly is this video longer than 5 minutes? Well, honestly, though the combat is extremely basic, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't enjoyable to some degree. Though the actual gameplay doesn't change much as you upgrade your powers, it does visually change things up. And since I'm used to Diablo-style games, there is something surprisingly relaxing about chopping down entire waves with the group stance, or getting a stun on a really nasty opponent to avoid a huge mess in the process. The stunning spell is way too powerful and throws the game balance completely out of whack, but given that the combat isn't terribly interesting, why not give me a way to potentially bypass it if the RNG gods are feeling merciful? In fact, despite the fact that there's a decent amount of downtime and traveling, I found it strangely calming beyond just the occasional fight. I think what really works in this game's benefit there is the music, which to fully understand my opinion of, you need to understand my first impression as well. For pretty much every game I review, I try to find the soundtrack so that I can use it as background audio, since that in most cases it makes for good ambience and gives you a feeling for what lies within. Before I downloaded it though, I wanted to make sure it would be worth keeping around beyond that, especially since I could get a FLAC version through GOG's website, which to the uninitiated means slightly better quality because there's no data loss in the file compression. Either way, I decided to look into it and see whether it would be worth adding to the rest of my collection. Huh, that's some really nice vocal work. Admittedly, it doesn't get much better than that, and I don't think the combat music is anything special, but when the ambience is good, it's really good. Outside of a couple of tracks and instruments which I know weren't in that part of the world at the time, it's also really authentic, and reminds me a lot of the Celtic music that I grew up listening to. And yes, I know there is a big difference between Celtic and Polish, but they sound similar enough to my largely untrained ear, especially since at the time period they're going for, most people use the same or very similar instruments between the two regions. So now that I've gotten the waffling over the music out of the way, let's get to what single-handedly won me over for this game, the story and characters. This is where I was able to justify the downtime, because the wait made everything work a lot better. It gave me time to think about the circumstances, figure out my next move, hunt for resources, and listen to the nice music all the while. It wasn't action-packed excitement, but did catch me in the same trance that Baldur's Gate 2 managed to pull off when I was replaying it last year. With that said, however, this wasn't what I got at first, because the presentation was a little off-putting, as especially when you know how good the character models and animations would get later down the road, this game looks archaic by those standards. It very much seems like BioWare's early attempts to make 3D games, which given the fact that it uses BioWare's Aurora engine, kinda makes sense. Actually, that might explain the combat system when compared to Knights of the Old Republic, but that's a topic for another day. What really works for me are the characters, as pretty much everything is reliant on them being compelling or interesting, which is done really well. I have very little knowledge of the source material, but I knew going in that this was a world of grays, and it did not disappoint. The people you encounter are all vastly different from each other, each with their struggles, quirks, and personalities, and there are very few, if any, characters that I think are poorly done. What really makes it work, though, is that virtually everyone has something about them that makes them some degree of unpleasant, disgusting, or just flat out evil. Either they're living a double life, or they're manipulating a terrible situation for their own profit, or they're horribly racist, or they're cannibals, or they're greedy, and so on and so forth. The first area you go to outside of the Witcher's Fortress of Kaer Morhen sets this idea in very quickly, and it never goes away. At some point I thought there might be at least one redeemable character that wasn't tarnished, and that there wouldn't be a line that they would cross. And I was right on one count. There was a redeemable character. I'm not going to say who, because it had a major impact on one of the crucial decisions you can make, but I did find one, I guess. Everyone else was either suspect or flat out wrong in some way, which made every decision so much harder to where I was physically uncomfortable when I got to the end of Chapter 4. Even some of your friends are like that, to a point where I'm still kind of bitter that the game made me choose between my red-headed waifus. I don't even care if that's a minor spoiler. How hard is it to just get along with each other, you idiots? So yeah, that made things really dark in a fair number of places, but let me also preface that by saying that for every bad trait, I can name something good about them. This character might be a womanizer, but he's someone that genuinely cares about humanity. This character might be a racist, but through terrible things directed at him by others, you can understand why he ended up like that. This character manipulated the suffering of others for her own profit, but don't necessarily deserve the harsh treatment for a problem affecting other characters that, in their case, was entirely self-inflicted. And that should tell people who have played the game all they need to know about that particular decision. On its own, this is really compelling in its own right, as most of the RPGs I've played had a clear morality system where you were either the worst or the best person ever, which means anytime I get something that forces me to operate in a gray area, I love it. And hate it, but mostly love it after the hard decisions are over. Usually. Where it really works though, is that these characters will eventually clash, and when that clash happens, you may find yourself in a situation where you'll have to take a side, which is not going to be comfortable when you have to explain why you sided with murderers instead of terrorists. Speaking of both of those things, the main plot threads are laden with all sorts of troubles because of that. The main thread that takes you from start to finish relates to the group that attacked you at Kaer Morhen, namely Salamandra. Most of your time is spent chasing clues as to their whereabouts, their motives, and what they're doing with the mutagens that they stole. They act as the closest thing to a bad guy in the story, though even here, not all is as it seems. Where it really gets dicey though, is when it comes to the conflict between humans and non-humans, as there is a lot going on with two groups in particular. One of these is the Order of the Flaming Rose, which are the closest that the game gets to paladins. Their goal as of late has been to maintain order while the king has been away, which has mostly meant chasing after a non-human group called the Scoia'tael. Said group are a bunch of freedom fighters who are sick of being treated poorly by humans, which given what you see when you meet one of your friends is definitely something worth fighting for. And yet both groups have their good and bad apples. The Order has their heart in the right place, but can end up being too power hungry, and perhaps a little too eager to go hunting after the Scoia'tael, which can end up validating their position. The Scoia'tael, on the other hand, also have their heart in the right place, but despite, or perhaps because of all the racism they faced, they ended up being the opposite side of the coin, all the while engaging in terrorism. Unfortunately for you, because these two factions are the main ones in play, you may be eventually forced to pick a side unless you deliberately avoid confrontations involving them. Which, given the fact that this is a video game, why would you ever do such a thing? Okay, I did technically avoid things in Chapter 2, but I'm not going to tell you how things went for me past that. Beyond the fact that there are so few good or bad guys, the lack of a solid black or white scenario also plays into the whole point of a Witcher. I can't give the game too much credit in this department as I don't recall them properly explaining the role of a Witcher, but since that they're much stronger, faster, and all that fun stuff compared to ordinary humans, they're also supposed to stay out of political matters through a pact of neutrality. By my understanding, it's technically possible to remain neutral, but that path ends up being really difficult, especially as tensions escalate to a boiling point. However, One place where this can clash unfavorably within Geralt's story is when it comes to, for lack of a better word, regaining his personality. Since that you don't remember anything that happened beforehand, outside of the stories your friends tell you, that means you effectively have a blank slate to work with. If I wanted to make more comparisons to RPGs, I'd say someone also played Planescape Torment, but I won't besmirch the writing by bringing that comparison up too much. It's not the most elaborate, but there is a lot of well-written dialogue, even if the voice acting is shaky in places. Getting back on topic, about halfway through the game, one of your red-headed waifus will have spent time thinking about your predicament, and will have an idea as to how you can work to get your memory back. The idea is that if you act with conviction or portray a strong personality, then you'll be able to hopefully regain something, even if it might not be the Geralt that they remember knowing for so long. The problem is that the dialogue doesn't really allow you to navigate the tenuous political situation in the city you're in, as well as develop the personality that you want. On one hand, said red-headed waifu told you to tread carefully when discussing political matters, as it was difficult to determine who exactly you can trust. But at the same time, she also told you to be strong in your convictions and open about who you are. That meant that when I gave what I thought was a softball answer, I hoped that it would be enough to maintain caution while still allowing a personality to shine through. But unfortunately, they too often took my responses to mean, you obviously believe this wholeheartedly, and we're going to define your personality based on that. Which wasn't necessarily the case. Full-blown honesty, nuance. Pick one. Actually, you don't even have to do that, because an option to lie or tell half-truths might have cleaned that up, even if the UI might have been messier for it. In the grand scheme of things, this might be a nitpick, but given that even some of the innocuous choices you make can have an impact on the ending, it would have been nice to have greater clarity in that regard. While we're on the subject of nitpicks, let's also talk about the game length, because when I was finished with the main story, it took me about 38 hours to complete. Part of me was grateful for that because there was plenty to see and do, and a lot of it seemed to connect in some way to what was going on. But there were places where that felt like it was just a little too long. Once you reach the epilogue, most of the important decisions have already been made, and then it's simply a matter of getting to the end. For the most part it's well paced, but it seemed like there was one too many fights getting in the way of the actual story. Perhaps that's the case because most of Geralt's dialogue is determined by what already happened, and they wanted to give us something to interact with, but when the only really challenge is at the end of all of that, I don't know if that was the greatest idea. It seemed like they tried to make more out of the epilogue than they needed to, especially when the idea driving said epilogue wasn't a bad one. Some of the game length though can be attributed to unfamiliarity with the game, which meant that I probably engaged in a little more backtracking than I might have necessarily needed to. That is especially the case given the nature of the quests themselves. Since Geralt is a witcher, most of the side quests are taken from notice boards that have a contract laid out for you to kill X number of creatures, and to bring proof of it. Most of these contracts require you to have an entry in the in-game glossary to do so, however, which is where completing everything will require you to buy or find a fair number of books. Other quests are basically fetch quests where you're trying to get something for another person, with the rest of them being taken up by goals to go into an area and clear out something where some group or another is based at. There is sometimes a decent challenge, especially when you're trying to figure out everything at your disposal, but as mentioned earlier, once you figure out how stunning works, it doesn't become too much of an issue. Some of these side quests might also involve one of the minigames, as there are a couple of ways to earn money if you're short on cash. One of them is by playing a game of dice with someone, which you can use to bet money as you slowly take on people who are supposedly better at it than you. I won't say who your final opponent can be in that regard, as it's a fun moment when it happens, but it is a nice little distraction at times. Another way to do so is to engage in an occasional fistfight at taverns. You will end up doing fistfighting at other points, but for the most part, it's just an exercise in getting a bit more gold for whatever you need to purchase. However, before I go, there is one aspect of the game that, if it isn't controversial, I'm surprised I didn't hear more about, and that is the card system. Since you're a witcher, all of the mutagens you took to become stronger also had the unfortunate side effect of making you infertile, which naturally means your exploits can be more than just, story-related. Yeah, you basically collect cards from sleeping with someone, and there are a surprising number of times when you're able to do that. Honestly, I can understand why someone would be offended by this, because you can make an argument for objectification and all that fun stuff since most of the cards show a fair amount, albeit as a still image. But when push comes to shove, I don't really care for a number of reasons. To start with, though I wouldn't normally approve of something like this in real life, this isn't real life. It's a video game, and what someone does in a video game doesn't necessarily translate to how they'll act in the real world. Hell, the whole point of some video games is to roleplay as something that we would never do otherwise, so I see very little distinction between this system and a game like Grand Theft Auto. even if you want to make an argument for objectification, everyone you do is a consenting adult, so by your own logic, how exactly is this demeaning? Although it does raise some uncomfortable questions for me regarding how much my dad saw before I got to hold to... Anyway, overall I can definitely understand why some people wouldn't like this game, and would also say that you can safely skip it and go straight to the sequels. I didn't think about it too actively while playing it, but when push comes to shove, the combat is overly repetitive, and most of the strategy involves rock, paper, scissors, or number crunching. And yet, when I was playing through it, I didn't think about how repetitive it was because it managed to create the same trance that Baldur's Gate 2 pulled off, simply by having a ton of interesting scenarios and characters. Though I was doing much of the same thing in the same area, it felt different because there was so much attention to detail given to said story and characters. The amount of downtime can overstay its welcome, but even then it can work to the game's advantage by giving you room to breathe and think about what's going on. When push comes to shove, it's a flawed game, but one which I can heartily recommend on the back of the story and characters alone. If the sequels manage to keep this element intact, then I will be a very happy gamer once I finally get to play them. But until then, you can find this game if you're interested on either Steam or GOG. However, bear in mind that while I was playing it, the game had more than its fair share of bugs and glitches. A good number of them were hilarious visual bugs, but some of them involved the game crashing more than it should have. I suspect the reason for that, however, was due to the fact that my power supply was dying at the time. And because of that, it might not have had everything in memory that it needed, and was therefore crashing under the weight of both that and my recording software. One thing that is very much worth mentioning is the fact that I ran into a game-breaking bug that forced me to use a save editor to get past. When you get to the swamp, there is a quest related to a number of obelisks, and because I started putting things on them before the quest was directly given to me, not all of them registered that I had indeed put something on them, meaning I couldn't progress with a main story quest. Said save file editor took me a bit to get working and was a little tricky to find, but now that you know the problem is possible, let that be a warning. This game can break in such a way that you literally have to cheat to fix it. Here's hoping that I was one of the rare few that ran into the problem. Either way, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. I'll admit, I wasn't sure how I was going to write this review without giving too much away, but apparently the answer to that is to give as few names as possible and make jokes out of what I do give away for the sake of explanation. Hopefully I didn't ruin any pivotal moments with what I showed on screen, which now that I think of it is not going to be an easy task. Either way, that task will by necessity be done when this video goes out, so here's to another 20 more reviews when I inevitably get off my lazy butt and finish a video game. So, as part of that, I'm gonna restart something I've had my eye on for a while, and we'll see you all later.